Some houses aren't built on foundations of stone and wood, but on echoes of terror. Blackwood Lane stood as a Gothic monument to a terrible secret, a secret etched in scars and fed by screams. It wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by something far more insidious. Silas Thorne. Dubbed the world's most dangerous prisoner, Thorne didn't wield knives or guns. His weapon was the human mind itself, and his sustenance was pure, unadulterated fear. When Anna and Mike stumbled upon their dream home, discounted for reasons no realtor dared reveal, they unlocked a door better left sealed. They stepped into a resonance chamber for terror, designed by a mad architect and perfected by a monster who learned to feast on sanity. This is what happens when the darkness doesn't just watch. It feeds. Let us know where you are watching from and what time you found this video. Anna and Mike felt as if they were holding a victory flag when they saw the "Sold" sign that had been hammered into the overgrown grass of 13 Blackwood Lane. After a number of months of looking, they had finally located their ideal Victorian home, which was magnificent, had a touch of Gothic, and was surprisingly reasonable. Although the real estate agent had murmured something about eccentric previous owners and needing vision, the price tag put an end to any concerns that may have been there. Their vision was clear. Context was something that they lacked all along. It was a symphony of settling moans that they heard during their first night together. The floorboards moaned because of the unusual weight, and the rusty pipes grumbled. Following that, the other noises started. It was whispers rather than groans. In the basement, it seems like the walls themselves are the source of the sound, rather than the wind. The low, guttural whispers held an evident weight of hostility, despite the fact that they did not produce any words. In their warm and inviting bedroom, they slithered up through the floor vents, causing the air to become chilly. While she was holding Mike's arm, Anna's knuckles became white. "Mike, that's not the house. That's someone." A primeval dread coil was felt in Mike's core, despite the fact that he is often the pragmatic one. The sensible answers, such as animals and settlement, were rendered ineffective when confronted with those voices that were sentient and hungry. He persisted. "Morning, Anna," with a tense tone into his voice. Fear, which was icy and slippery, held him stuck to the bed. "It's pitch black down there. If it is something, better to face it with sunlight." It looked as if the murmurs were licking at the quiet. There was no bravery to be found in dawn, just a sad need. As they downed the creaky basement steps, they were armed with a hefty maglite and Mike's grandfather's ancient hunting knife, which was more of a talisman than a tool. Earth, mildew, and a subtle but persistent scent of copperiness started to permeate the air, which became more dense and humid. They were able to illuminate piled boxes, neglected furniture that was covered in dusty sheets, and walls that were lined with rough-hewn stone with the beams of their flashlights, which cut wobbly cones through the darkness. At that moment, the beams came together on the other corner, next to an old door that was secured with iron, which they had not seen previously. And he was standing there. He was not only towering, rather, he was a monolith that had been chiseled out of darkness and dread. It seemed as if his physique was straining the very fabric of the faint light. He was well over 6.5 feet of height. Ragged garments that were filthy dangled from shoulders that seemed to be capable of breaking stone. Nevertheless, it was his expression that halted the scream that Anna was trying to let out. One of the eyes was a milky orb that was completely blind, while the other eye was a stunning and unsettling light blue color that burned with an intellect that seemed both old and completely foreign. His face were covered in thick white scars that crisscrossed all over them like a map of unimaginable horror. His lips were drawn back in a rictus that was not quite a grin, exposing teeth that were yellowed and cracked. The man did not move. He only persisted in his observation, exuding a calmness that was more menacing than any charge. When Anna let out a yell, the quiet was broken. They did not consider. Rather, they ran away. It was not back upstairs, but rather further into the labyrinth of the basement, when they stumbled upon a tiny storage room that was devoid of windows. Mike slammed the door, struggling with the ancient, hefty lock, and his breath came out in harsh rushes as he entered the room. A high-pitched tremor could be heard in Anna's voice on the phone when she dialed 911. Her description, which was propelled by sheer dread, came forth as she yelled out, "Police, please! There's a man in our basement! He's huge like a monster! Scars! One dead eye! He looks like he crawled out of a grave! 13 Blackwood Lane! Hurry!" The peace and quiet of the dispatcher's voice was a savior. "Units are responding, ma'am. Stay locked in. Do not engage." I click. A last shriek of a high pitch was released by the line before it completely disappeared into stillness. The line did not just stop working suddenly, they were plunged into a claustrophobic blackness when the inexpensive overhead light in the storage room fiercely flickered once, twice, and finally died. The only sound that could be heard was their own frantic breathing, followed by the slow and methodical scrape of something heavy dragging over the concrete floor outside the door. Gets closer. The sound of Anna's scream was one of unadulterated horror. Mike came up behind her and braced his back against the weak door, holding out the knife in a way that was completely ineffective in the dark. At that same moment, the scraping came to an end. They were able to sense his presence, which manifested as a physical pressure and a surge of chilly waves that traveled through the wood. This was the end. It had been discovered by the monster. A prisoner who was the most dangerous in the world was locked up in their basement, and they were confined together like rats. Then, a sound that they had not anticipated it, not even a grumble. It is not a fate. It was a whisper. Certainly it was not the rumbling sound coming from the walls. As if it were shards of ice, this was more transparent and colder, and it cut through the darkness. Anna was able to feel the vibration all the way from behind the door, which was located exactly behind it. "Do you know?" The voice that was rasping, chillingly eloquent, devoid of rage, and filled with a dreadful, tired understanding, said, "Why they call me the world's most dangerous prisoner?" There is no sound. I heard Anna whimper. Mike's hold on the knife, which was dripping with perspiration, became more firm. "It wasn't the bodies," the whisper continued, giving the impression that it was a discussion. "Though there were enough. Nor the escapes. 5 maximum security facilities. Child's play." Once again, the scrape occurred, but this time it was gentler, like if he had leaned against the door. The chill became more intense. He murmured, "It was the silence," as he said. The perfect silence I could create, not by... As the claustrophobic misery that was taking place behind the stone walls of the basement storage room was taking place, the sirens were a terrible taunt against the distant promise that they were. Despite the fact that Silas Thorne had promised to show them their demons, Anna and Mike did not simply see them before. They evolved into them. The darkness was not devoid of contentment for Anna. It writhed in pain. The name of her childhood imaginary friend, who had been a reassuring presence in the past, now slithered from the walls with a presence that was both guttural and menacing. However, it was not her pal who said, "Anne." It was the thing that her buddy had purportedly shielded her from, a formless fear that was rendered explicit by Thorne's manipulation and the acoustics of the basement. It had long, spindly arms that ended in needle-sharp points, a gaping mouth where a face should have been, and it was pouring a viscous blackness that smelled of decay and forgotten graves. She watched it form from the shadows near the ceiling. It was not assaulting her, rather it was inviting her, and for a split second, its shape shifted to resemble the outline of her own mother. After that, it dissipated back into the nightmare it had been. Her back struck Mike as she rushed backwards, but he was no longer her spouse at this terrifying moment. Mike was in a new kind of hellish place. Fear of inadequacy, the persistent dread that he wasn't strong enough, clever enough for Anna, and enough for life, broke into the physical reality of the situation. Instead of becoming monsters, the shadows began to take the shape of mirrors. The cramped room was filled with dozens of distorted mirrors of himself, each one a hideous parody of his shortcomings. The first Mike was crying violently and grasping his knees. The second Mike was furious and was pounding his fists against the stone wall, which remained stubbornly solid. And the third Mike was just staring at him with eyes that were empty and accusatory, and they drilled into Mike's soul. He attempted to scream them down, to locate the real Anna, but his voice was lost in the cacophony of his own projected anxieties. They muttered in unison, a frightening chorus using his own voice. "Failure. Weakling. She deserves better. You couldn't even protect her from the dark." He was unable to discover the real Anna. Not even Silas Thorne made his way inside the room. He had no reason to do so. In the suffocating darkness, he stood just outside the entrance, casting a darker shadow than the others. The gleaming delight that emanated from his one and only pale blue eye was terrifying. He was not seeing the phantoms. Rather, he was observing Anna and Mike the whole time. Despite the fact that the basement was a cold place, he saw the tremors that were racking their bodies, the perspiration that was beading on their skin, and the frenzied dilation of their pupils. As he watched, he saw that Anna's breath came out in ragged, fearful gasps, and that Mike's muscles froze in a paralyzing fear with his muscles. It seemed as if he was listening to a symphony that only he could hear, as he inclined his head slightly. His voice, which was not loud but was impossibly clear and vibrated in the marrow of their bones, sliced through their inner hells and sent them soaring. "Yes. That's it. Let it bloom. Let it consume." His approach was methodical and gradual as he moved closer. The atmosphere surrounding him seemed to get chillier and heavier, exerting a force that had the effect of tugging at their anxiety. Although he did not intend to threaten, he did raise one of his dirty, scarred hands at the same time. It was a stifled sob that Anna let out as she recoiled from the shadow thing that was groping for her. Her face was covered in filth, and a solitary tear made its way through the mess. It caught Thorne's attention suddenly. His hand flew forward with an uncanny elegance and speed that I could not have imagined. It was precisely as the tear was falling down her jawline that his calloused fingertip made contact with it. While his lips were cracked, he applied the moisture to them. His big form was rippling with a shiver that was not one of repulsion, but rather of intense pleasure, that was nearly euphoric in nature. It seemed as if his milky eye was becoming more cloudy, while the pale blue eye was burning brighter. He spoke the word ambrosia, a sigh of genuine ecstasy as he breathed it out. The purest vintage, fear distilled by despair. In the distance, the sirens reached their highest point. The frenzied, stuttering shadows that danced over Thorne's monstrous body, and the couple who were stuck in their mental prisons were cast by the red and blue lights that pulsed through the little dirty basement window that was high up on the wall. The actual world was making its presence known via the sounds of slamming automobile doors, the crunch of tires on gravel, and the shouting of demands. Thorne did not show any signs of flinching. His gaze lingered on Anna and Mike with the possessive pleasure of a collector examining rare objects. He dropped his hand and continued to look at them. There was no disappearance of the frightening apparitions that were torturing them. Nevertheless, they did flicker, and their intensity was briefly diminished by the entry of flashing lights and authoritative yells that echoed down the stairs. Thorne mumbled, "Interruptions," with a trace of irritation across his broken face. "Interruptions," he said. Then, however, a slow and horrifying grin made its way over the face, exposing even more of those damaged teeth. There was no warmth in the grin. Rather, it was a smile of unending patience and cold promise. But the house is hungry, and it remembers its guests. He retreated a step and disappeared into the deeper shadows that were located close to the ancient iron door. At the same time as the crushing weight of his presence began to diminish, the stifling cold began to lift somewhat. But Anna and Mike did not rid themselves of their worry. After he had unleashed the horrors that were contained inside them, it clung to them like a second skin, increased tenfold. In addition to being damaged vessels, they were brimming with the dread that Thorn had tasted. The steps in the basement were being hammered by boots. None of them came from the basement, from the four corners of the main chamber in the basement. Murmurs that are faint and overlay one another, barely on the verge of being heard. Riggs was certain that he heard his daughter's voice approaching him from behind a pile of boxes and asking, "Daddy?" She was confident that she saw a dusty sheet ripple with something below it, so Chen yanked her light in the direction of the debris. "He's playing," Chen murmured, her fingers becoming white as she tightened her grasp on the revolver. "He's testing the water, seeing what we're afraid of." An abrupt and piercing snap reverberated, and it was the sound of wood splintering. The lights converged on the entrance of the old storage room where Anna and Mike had escaped, and they twisted around together. The large bolt that they had discovered had been slid open and was now lying on the ground. It had been cracked straight through the center, as if it were made of balsa wood. The door itself was slightly ajar in its position. Riggs snarled while asking, "Did you see that?" "It just broke." Chen approached the chamber with caution, her light penetrating the gloom that pervaded the otherwise dim space. There were just a few pieces of debris spread about. The atmosphere inside, on the other hand, was heavy and worn, and it was permeated with a lingering fear that made her skin crawl. Additionally, a new mark was found there, etched deeply into the hardwood flooring that were located close to the rear wall. There is no word at this time. A sign consisting of a rough spiral, similar to a vortex, with a single eye that is looking at the center of the spiral. It was a revolting experience. Over time, the whispers became more audible and clear. When his father was on his deathbed, Riggs heard the wet cough that his chain-smoking father produced. Chen was able to hear the mocking laughter of a suspect who had escaped from the police station many years before, a case that continued to torment her. In addition to being audible, the noises carried a significant amount of emotional weight, with hooks of humiliation and remorse that penetrated deeply. Chen was able to hear a voice that appeared to speak directly into his ear, saying, "He's not just feeding." The sound was so distinct that it was almost scary. Nor was it Thorn's rasping sound. She sounded like she was being commanded by her own superior. "He's preparing the ground. The house remembers the taste. It wants more." Chen spun around, his rifle high, and illuminated nothing but empty space. With his face pallid and his eyes flickering madly, Riggs was gradually making his way towards the stairs. "We need to get out, Chen. This isn't our fight. This is hell." They were plunged into a near-total darkness, with the exception of their frantically dancing flashlight beams, brought on by the explosion of the above bulb, which caused a shower of sparks. As time went on, the hum became a disturbing drone. Beginning at the entrance to the sub-basement, a more profound darkness seemed to separate itself. There was not a man-like figure, but rather a presence, a concentration of the chill and the dread that was whispering. The voice of Thorn was not too loud as he said, "Leaving so soon, officers?" The walls, the floor, and even the icy air itself were all sources of the strange odor. It was a lousy source of entertainment. But the performance has only just begun. And you carry such interesting fears, the weight of failure, the sting of inadequacy, the gnawing doubt. First, Chen experienced it. A jolt of crushing despondency that has nothing to do with the circumstance. Suddenly, the faces of all the victims whom she believed she had failed to save were before her eyes, their accusations resonating loudly in the murmuring darkness. The hold that she had on her weapon shrank. A sudden stifling belief that Riggs had never been strong enough, that he had never defended anybody, and that his family was secretly embarrassed of him, caused him to cry out while grasping his chest. Riggs was overcome by this profound realization. With the resonating chamber of the basement and the master manipulator that was located inside it, the concerns that Thorne had identified were multiplied by a factor of 100. Within Chen's peripheral vision, the spiral sign that was located on the floor of the storage room seemed to emit a faint light. As it opened further, the iron door that led to the sub-basement moaned on its hinges, exposing nothing but a void of blackness that seemed to go on forever. As a result of the mental storm that was forming within the Whisper House, the sirens that were outside sounded as if they were in the far distance. No, Silas Thorne had not run away. He had not concealed himself. He had simply returned to the center of his power, which was the awful resonance chamber of the architect, and transformed the whole basement into a trap that was baited with the officers' own souls if they were caught. The ground for feeding was prepared. Arrival of the main course had occurred, and the most dangerous prisoner in the world, who was not visible but could be felt in every shivering whisper and crushing wave of uncertainty, entered the room to take pleasure in the feast. It was not the cavalry that the cops were. They came up in the next class. A textbook entry was submitted for SWAT. The stuffy air on the main level was jolted by flashbangs, which strobbed the dusty lobby in a bright white color. With guns sweeping and communication fast and clipped across the tack net, armored men poured in the front door and kitchen entry despite the fact that they had been broken. First floor clear. Moving to stairs. Heavy cold source emanating basement. Chen, Riggs, respond. Status. There is no sound. Only the fading echo of the flashbangs and the oppressive deepening hum that vibrated up through the floors responded to their screams for help once they were heard. In the process of taking Alpha Squad down the great staircase towards the basement entrance, Sergeant Bishop had the sensation of cold seeping through his boot soles. It was not merely a matter of temperature, rather it was a lack, a hole that was devoid of both warmth and optimism. The tack net that was in his ear began to fizz, and a sudden surge of static eventually resolved into a guttural voice that was neither Riggs or Chen. "Welcome to the gallery," he said. Bishop yelled out, "Contact!" as he applied pressure on the trigger guard with his finger. "Psychoacoustic interference. Maintain discipline. Eyes sharp." They broke through the door to the basement. There seemed to be a fight between the darkness and the bright LED flashlights that were supposed to remove shadows. The chilly weather struck them like a punch to the body. With her flashlight beam vibrating fiercely and her gaze locked on the crude spiral eye sign that was located on the floor of the storage room, Chen stood rigidly near the open entrance to the sub-basement. The scenario was a picture of pandemonium frozen in horror. Her expression was one of utter fear, and tears were running down her cheeks in silence. A few feet away, Riggs was kneeling on the ground, grasping his helmet as if he were attempting to crush it. He was rocking back and forth and saying, "Not strong enough, never strong enough." Bishop yelled out, "Medic!" But his voice was low and sounded like it was being swallowed up by the buzzing darkness. "Secure them! Beta team, cover that sub-basement entrance!" During the time when two members of SWAT were moving towards Chen and Riggs, the whispering started. There were no overlapping whispers as there were previously. These were individualized gifts. Bishop's brain was filled with a voice that sounded like gravel and blood. It was a flawless imitation of his former staff sergeant Ramirez, who had passed out while he was holding him. "Remember Fallujah, Bishop? That kid with the RPG? You hesitated. You always hesitate when it counts." Bishop clenched his teeth with determination. "Ignore the auditory hallucinations. It's a tactic." "Is it?" Ramirez said with a moist giggle in his voice. "Or is it the truth you bury? The reason Sarah left? She saw the weakness, too." Officer Vance, who was protecting the entrance to the sub-basement, let out a gasp from across the room. He jerked his laser beam in an irregular manner. "No, Jenny, stop!" His daughter's voice, which was both lovely and twisted, moaned from the darkness beyond the iron door. "Daddy, why did you let the bad man hurt me? You were supposed to protect me." Vance had lost his daughter to a hit-and-run accident that he had attended to but failed to prevent as he lowered his weapon. Bishop screamed, "Vance, snap out of it!" as he struggled against the serpentine tendrils of his own uncertainty that were winding around his spine. As if one were wading in frozen oil, the air became thicker and more resistive. The buzzing became more intense, causing their body armor to vibrate and reverberating in their brains each time. Next, the lights stopped working. Not just the flashlights, of course. Every single tack light that was attached to every single gun and helmet went out at the same time, throwing them into a complete and utter darkness. Shouts of panic sprang forth, but they were immediately absorbed by the darkness. The words, "Lights are a crutch," which were said by Thorne, reverberated not from a specific location, but rather from the core of their collective terror. "You rely on them to banish the dark, but the dark is where truth lives, where I live." Under the ideal conditions of darkness, the personalized terrors became impossible to avoid. Bishop discovered that Ramirez's blood, which was hot and sticky, was once again seeping through his gloves. He smelt a mixture of desert dust and cordite. As Vance looked down at the shattered corpse of his daughter lying on the tarmac, her accusatory eyes were wide. In the basement, where he had been locked for 3 days as a boy, another cop named Diaz heard the sound of water dripping relentlessly from a pipe that was leaking. This was the same sound that had filled the cellar. Marks, the physician who was attempting to reach Riggs, suddenly saw the cold stone floor under him transform into the freezing pond where his brother had drowned. The burden of failure was drawing him down. These days, the basement was doing more than simply amplifying anxiety. It was really making it materialize. Despite the fact that he was certain that icy water was flowing into his lungs, Diaz yelled and clawed at his helmet. On dry ground, Marks thrashed about on the floor as if he were drowning. Vance yelled out the name of his daughter as he discharged his weapon into the darkness without looking anywhere. As Bishop struggled to maintain control, he was surrounded by Ramirez's blood and the disdain of his ex-wife. After searching for a chemical light stick that was attached to his vest, he snapped it. The dull green illumination was able to push back the darkness just enough to show a scene that was straight out of a nightmare. He and his crew were not battling an adversary. Rather, they were fighting phantoms of their own damaged psyches inside themselves. Chen was now hurting her fingers as she scratched at the sign of a spiral eye that was lying on the floor. While he was crying, Riggs had pulled his sidearm and was placing it to his own temple in a feeble manner. In addition, darker shadows were seen swirling from the wide maw of the sub-basement entrance. The emanations were not Thorne himself. Rather, they were frigid, grabbing tendrils of sheer dread that snaked out and wound themselves around Vance's ankles as he shouted at the ghost of his daughter. These tendrils seemed to squeeze the raw anguish that was flowing out of him. In the darkness, Thorne's voice said, "Observe," and it was a contented purr. "The house feeds. It learned from me. It hungers for the resonance of your despair. Your fears are the keys to its power." The understanding that Bishop had was chillingly clear. They were not only victims, rather, they were simply discharges. The heightened fear that they were experiencing was giving Thorne and the sentient hunger that the Whisper House itself was experiencing a boost. Even though her fingers were covered in blood, the spiral eye sign that Chen was defacing seemed to have a faint pulse in the green darkness. He just had one opportunity. Discipline is required. Pay attention. He feared that he might fail, and he hesitated. He was forced to take decisive action against an adversary that he was unable to shoot. His voice was filled with every ounce of power and every shred of rebellion against the crushing misery that he was experiencing. "Alpha! Beta!" Bishop said and bellowed. "Sound off! Name and rank, now!" It was a choking sob that came out. "V! Vance! Officer! Diaz! Officer! Trapped! Water! Marks! Medic! Drowning!" Although they were sloppy and filled with fear, the replies were reactions nevertheless. Against the assault of illusion, Bishop concentrated on the sound of their voices and their identities, holding to the reality of his squad in order to protect himself from the assault. Bishop yelled out, "Listen to me!" as he approached the door to the sub-basement. The green light that surrounded him made him seem to be a ghostly apparition. "He's in the dark! He is the dark! He feeds on what you give him! Deny him! Remember your training! Remember who you are!" His worthless gun was lifted, but not to fire. Rather, it was raised as a symbol. The words "Thorn" were yelled out into the void. "You want fear? Fear this! We stand together! Your tricks won't break us all!" When he was hit by a wave of tremendous cold, it was accompanied by a mental reaction of pure venom. The light that was green fluctuated erratically. His images of Sarah leaving, Ramirez passing away, and his own father's despair smashing over him were magnified 1,000-fold, and Bishop struggled to catch his breath. His determination began to waver, and he felt the frigid fingers of uncertainty pressing down on his heart. However, a voice that was trembling could be heard coming from behind him. "It is Vance." Then another one of them said, "Sergeant, Bishop, sir." "It is Diaz." "Together," Marks exclaims, "standing." Together. It was not very much. This is a glimmer of defiance in the midst of an ocean of fear. However, that was a fact, and even a glimmer of shared bravery was enough to cause dissonance in the resonant chamber of the Whisper House, which was exacerbated by the house's own hunger and Thorn's might. As they approached the door to the sub-basement, the shadows that were spinning back and forth, although it was only for a moment, the crushing weight of the particular atrocities began to relieve itself. Suddenly, the buzzing stopped. A guttural growl reverberated from the depths of the sub-basement. It was a sound of unadulterated wrath that had been repressed. There was not even a murmur. The observation is not very cool, anger that is unfiltered and raging. Thorn's voice blasted through the darkness, shorn of its icy control and vibrating with a rage that rocked the stones. "Defiance?" he asked. "A spark against the void? I will extinguish it. I will show you depths of fear that will shatter your pathetic unity. The house demands it." The darkness moved forward, becoming more icy and hungry than it had been before. The pause had come to an end. Thorn and the Whisper House, infuriated by the Defiance, made preparations to submerge them not only in their personal worries, but also in a collective, overpowering torrent of pure, annihilating horror. It was only now that the fight for sanity had started its most difficult phase.